Hi guys, John Florez again, and this one's really special and controversial. Okay, so I'd love to hear your opinions, positive and negative. There are going to be a lot of negatives, I'm pretty sure, on this. I was hoping my health would be better in order to record this, but I'm just so anxious to do it that here goes. Put up with me, okay? So here are my reactions to Carpenter's The Musical Legacy, the book that Richard had ghostwritten with a couple of other name writers. So in short, if you're looking at this book, this is a music nerd's book. This is just great for people like me. The previous Carpenter's books, which Richard did not authorize, were more of a family history, and it covers a lot of what the parents were like and her anorexia and his quaaludes and all of this stuff, which is great. However, music lovers want to know what Richard wrote about in this one. So every single release, and I don't mean single records, I mean every record release that they had is documented in full, and background information is given on how they wrote the songs or how they found outside material, the creative thinking behind why they chose the songs and what they wanted to accomplish. This is stuff that is down in the musical weeds, which I love. And if you're real Carpenter's fans, music aficionado fans, you will love the musical detail that he goes into. Now, this book is over 700 pages long, and the second half is mostly release statistics. And frankly, that's just kind of a quick scan. The real meat is in the first half of the book, okay, where Richard confides in a whole lot of stuff musically that you haven't heard before. Okay, so my first reaction upon reading the book was Jack Doherty, their producer, the A&M staff producer. I'm sorry. It took Karen and Richard 2 years to go to Jerry Moss and Herb Alpert and say, wait a minute, he's not producing these records, Richard is. And Jack has gotten full producer's royalties for records that he basically didn't produce, he administrated. You know what they call that in my business? Executive producer. And maybe you give him 1 percentage point of retail or wholesale sales as his royalty, but he doesn't get a full producer's royalty. He was administrating these puppies. Okay, Richard was owed that money, and it's just very upsetting to see that this went on for 2 years. This should have stopped after their first hit album, and Richard should have gotten full credit and full royalties. Okay, that's my first thought. Okay, fast forward to 1976 to 1977. This is a critical time in the Carpenters' career. They had already reached the pinnacle of most artists' career by that point, and now they were trying to decide what to do to keep that momentum going because it appeared like it was beginning to fade. Okay, here's where we go with a lot of the controversial stuff, and I want to hear from you about it. Okay, now this is in John's fantasy world. So what you're about to hear is John's made-up retrospective of what he would have done had I been asked to participate at any level in the Carpenter's career between 1976 and 1977. So in 1976 and 1977, the label and Richard agreed that he was completely overworked. Between the road and having to arrange, write, or find the tunes, produce, and sing on the Carpenters' albums, he needed a little relief. So the label agreed that they would contact 3 producers, Kyle Lenning, Richard Perry, and Joe Wissert, who were all named producers at the time, and A&M asked them one at a time if one of them would be interested in helping Richard out in the studio for what would become the Passage album, I believe. But in 1976, all 3 named producers turned down the offer of working with Richard on the new album to take the load off of him. Okay, now I'm sorry, I would have jumped at that in a heartbeat. I would have been there. Oh my goodness. Here's why that wasn't a possibility for me at the time, and why I wasn't offered an opportunity to work with him after the other 3 producers had turned down the offer. Okay, here you go. After Clive Davis dropped The Fifth Dimension from Aristo, while our record was climbing up the charts with bullets and all of that stuff. My record career as I knew it was essentially over. Yes, I came back like a dummy in '78 and did Helen Reddy and Frida Payne, but I shouldn't have. I retired in 1975 and moved with my wife to the small town of Ojai, O-J-A-I, up near Santa Barbara. I had had enough, and I wanted a small town that I could participate in. I could go to Kiwanis Club, which I did, join the tennis club in town, which I did, be part of the community, which I tried to be, all of that stuff. I wanted a simple, small town life instead of the LA record producer's life. What I didn't plan on was that my wife and I would divorce. And that was a shocker, because no longer was I going to live in the country. I didn't know what I was going to do because Carol wasn't there with me. She'd been with me since college days. So I'm in our country home in Ojai scratching my head saying, what just happened? Well, I went home to Phoenix, as usual, to lick my wounds and decide what was next. And I had kind of a blast while I was there. But those years, get this, 1976 and 1977, those were the years that I was back in Phoenix licking my wounds from my divorce. I wasn't available in Los Angeles since I had already retired. I wasn't available to A&M. I wasn't even in their thought process because I had left a couple of years prior to move to a small town and enjoy my new life. So they didn't know that John Florez would be interested in working with Richard Carpenter. They hadn't a clue. I was out of the loop, so to speak. Well, let me say this, which is total conjecture. Even if I had been in the loop, even if I had chosen to return to LA instead of Phoenix after my wife and I divorced, there was a problem for me with A&M Records at the time. I had done multiple projects for them prior to retiring. As many of you know, I started with Sisters Love in 1970, all the way through Carl Graves and LAX, and then the breakup of that group, and then doing the solo artists for them. Renee Armand, I loved those tracks. I worked a lot at A&M. But what happened when Clive and the Fifth Dimension and I broke up so dramatically, and there was much anger and bitterness attached to that, Clive Davis was politically very close to my attorney, Abe Summer. You may remember that from my other Helen Reddy story. You know, these are people you don't piss off. So I had angered Clive Davis in the Fifth Dimension days, and Clive and Abe Summer were very close contacts, power contacts. If you offend one, you have offended the other. I can tell you for a fact that when I came back to town in '78, I had to apologize profusely to my attorney, Abe Summer, in order for him to go to bat for me again and work aggressively for me to help get new artists. Helen Reddy was the one at that time. But inadvertently, by pissing off Clive Davis with the Fifth Dimension, I had angered Abe Summer, my attorney, and Abe Summer is one of the three people that ran A&M Records. You have Herb Alpert, Jerry Moss, and legal counsel Abe Summer. So even if I had moved back from my divorce to LA instead of Phoenix, I don't think A&M would have considered me to work with Richard, because Abe Summer probably wouldn't have wanted anything to do with me at A&M at that time. Darn it. You know, this is where fate intervenes, but this would have been a dream of mine, to work with Richard Carpenter. The idea that they had at A&M at the time was to have another producer come in and just help him out with stuff. Richard was still going to be involved, but just take a lot of the load off of him. Administratively, I could have done that. I could have contributed with a lot of my song contacts to filter in more material to him. I could have been basically his administrator. He was still the boss, but John would have worked with him. I would have liked an executive producer, 1% royalty for helping him. That's all. And I'm sorry, he and I would have gotten along great, and I could have been of immense help, I think. But that was not because I was floating around in my swimming pool in Phoenix saying, what am I going to do now? Okay, so back to 1976, 1977. And Richard ends up having to take full responsibility and took a year to do the Passage album. And here's the interesting cover where the name doesn't appear on the front cover. I don't get that, but That's just me. Had I been involved, I probably would have opted to have the word passage somewhere more visible on the front cover. A&M at the time was pushing for the Carpenters to kind of update their sound and become more contemporary. They had kind of a lifelong issue with being perceived as this sweet, middle of the road, lush productions. And they thought, well, maybe we can try something new. I understand that. But remember, and this is in retrospect, this is what I would have done, very important, knowing then what I know now. We know that Sherwin Bash, their manager prior to '76, who was also a friend of Karen and Richard's and managed Richard a couple of decades later, Sherwin Bash was replaced by Jerry Weintraub, who was a power manager in Los Angeles and in the music business in general. The guy was a jerk. I'm sorry, may he rest in peace, but he was pushy, aggressive, very money-oriented, and I would have had a very hard time ever working with him. But he came in to manage them, and he, as you can read in Richard's book, overworked them. If Sherwin Bash had them on the road a lot, Jerry Weintraub doubled it. I don't know, I made that figure up, but this is ridiculous. Plus TV specials, plus pushing for new inventive albums. I would have suggested someone like Marty Ehrlichman, Barbra Streisand's manager at the time. I don't mean that Marty would have been interested, but somebody like that, who was a middle-of-the-road female singer, brilliant personal manager, solo career manager. Tony Bennett's son did that as well for Tony Bennett. We're talking 60-year careers as recording artists. But you had to go the solo route, and you had to, wait for it, this is what's going to piss a lot of people off, you had to go to Columbia Records, in my opinion, at the time. So as opposed to the Carpenters trying to do, disco or experiment with new sounds as a group, it's time for Karen to go out on her own, with Richard doing all the heavy lifting again for her. But it's time to go to Columbia with a new personal manager that knows how to handle that kind of solo artist. Most of the music business managers were whores, pardon the expression, but they are money-grubbing, pushy people. You wanted somebody who understood this genre and could very gently take Karen and Richard from Carpenters to Karen. And I highly recommend you go to the A&M blog on the Carpenters, which is just rich with opinions and stories, commentary that you won't see anywhere else. The link is below this video in the details. Please go there, check it out. There are wonderful dialogues going on, even after all these years on the Carpenters. So you look at Barbra Streisand, 60-year career at Columbia Records. You look at Tony Bennett, 60-year career at Columbia Records. You look at Johnny Mathis, 70 years with a little brief Mercury Records episode in the middle of that, but 60 plus years at Columbia Records and still recording for them. These are solo, pop, middle of the road artists. They are not selling rock and roll records. They are not selling top 100 records unless they do duets with somebody more contemporary, which they all did. A brief aside before I go on. You would not know this nor expect this, but the Johnny Mathis album that I produced in 1975, which had 0 hits on it, it was cover songs, other people's hits. There was not a single to be heard off of that album. And it was released internationally, and because of international sales, my initial check for that album exceeded what I made on my first check from the multi-million-dollar single and album with Rock the Boat, a #1 record. Johnny Mathis internationally outsold the Hughes Corporation. Why? John had an international market to choose from, and Columbia Records knows how to market albums and knows how to market those kind of singers. Nobody else could do that. Another aside, 1969, I'm back at the RCA National Convention in New York, sitting around the table with Chet Atkins and other top RCA producers, and it came to a vote. The vote was whether we were going to keep our middle-of-the-road solo artists for much longer on the label. And I was the only dissenting vote. I wanted to keep them. They didn't lose money, but they didn't make money, and RCA wanted to make money, and my position was this is a part of our musical history, so keep at least 2 or 3 or 4 of them, for God's sakes, which they did for a little while. But I was the only dissenting vote. Labels were dropping the middle-of-the-road singers, except for Columbia keeping their biggest selling ones, which they have kept forever. These artists are still making money off of records. Now, you say, okay, but they don't make as much money as if they were having pop Hot 100 hit records. No, they're not. Let me ask you this. How many millions and millions and millions of dollars is it worth to have a hit top 100 record as opposed to millions of dollars just doing middle-of-the-road international release albums? And here we go. This is going to be pretty controversial. Don't go on the road anymore as the Carpenters, because now the act is called Karen. It's as simple as that. I will never forget going several years ago to a Crystal Gayle concert. Did Crystal Gayle take a band with her and singers? No. Crystal Gayle and the Phoenix Symphony Orchestra. Crystal Gayle and the Boston Pops Orchestra. Here's what I'm saying. We all know, if I knew then what I know now, we all know that the road was getting to both Karen and Richard and leading them to their health issues. Okay, if we could have stopped that in its tracks in 1976 or 77 by changing to Columbia Records, changing to middle-of-the-road management, and just doing primarily orchestral concerts with existing symphony orchestras. Come on, there's no stress. You don't take a band on the road, you don't take singers on the road, you don't have all the muss and fuss. You show up and you sing with a full orchestra. Come on, which is healthier for you? That or what they actually ended up doing, which was just beating the shit out of their health. Okay, I'm sorry, my idea is better. Would I have known it back then? I don't know. But I was an advocate for that kind of act back then, and so maybe that would have been my input in 1976, 77. To leave Herb Alpert and Jerry Moss would have just been very, very difficult because they're almost like parent figures to Karen and Richard. But come on, Columbia was kicking ass doing that, and those artists still have record careers in addition to their concert performances. And you know, Mathis is out there in his 90s still doing concerts and still making great international sales on records. How many millions of dollars are enough? By 1976, the Carpenters were both millionaires, and they would continue to accrue their fortune if they did it my way. And they'd probably be a lot healthier if they had done that. Okay, throw everything you got at your screen right now and say, John, you're an old man fool. What the hell are you talking about? But it's not fair on the A&M blog, for instance, to compare Karen and Richard to, say, Barry Manilow or Bette Midler, artists like that. That isn't what I'm talking about. Do they have 60-year recording careers? No, they don't. The ones that do are still at Columbia, other than Tony, bless his heart, rest in peace. Okay. And Tony took a lot of gambles back in his day that were considered gambles. I mean, he does Bennett Sings Berlin, or whatever the name of that Irving Berlin album was. There was lots of room to experiment there. You can do duets, you can do movie things, you can do anything that you can come up with for a solo artist to do. And if you want to use the Carpenters' signature harmony on some songs, you know, fine, do that. It's still, the act is still called Karen, but now you can do what Richard talked about before, blending in singers. Even he used the term mocha, which I have used before in terms of Karen. You know, bring in some black singers. with my concept, it was bring in male and female black singers, but he had started experimenting with that back in, 76, 77. He was starting to do a little bit of that. But for God's sakes, go to Columbia, get a middle-of-the-road, gentle manager who will take care of you for decades, do your concerts, and make your international sales, and be healthier for it. Okay, that's all I got to say. I know I pissed a whole bunch of you off, but the fun part is it's going to create one hell of a dialogue over at the A&M blog. At least that's what I'm expecting. That should be interesting to see. Okay, I highly recommend you go there if you're a Carpenters fan. Okay, this is John Florez, the old man in poor health, but having to do this chapter 4 of the Karen Carpenter story from my point of view, because I think more than anything else, I enjoy doing these the most. Okay, you guys take care. As always, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.